Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. From the summit to his speech to the U.S. Congress, President Yoon Suk Yeol brought the 70-year-old alliance between South Korea and the U.S. to another level, expanding the scope from a value-based alliance to a global comprehensive strategic one. He wrapped up his schedule in Washington, D.C. and now is to begin his itinerary in Boston. Before his Boston journey starts, we would like to make an overall assessment of major events that have highlighted President Yoon Suk Yeol's state visit so far. And for that, we've invited Hans Schattle, professor at Yonsei University, into the studio. Professor Schattle, good to see you again.
Hi, Bo-kyung. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Now, first question. President Yoon Suk Yeol and Joe Biden delivered a joint statement after the summit, and the focus was on addressing new emerging challenges as a global comprehensive strategic alliance. How did you evaluate the summit and the outcomes, and what is the importance of coming up with this comprehensive alliance to tackle a wide range of issues?
Right. I think this was really interesting, Bo-kyung, because it showed how much the alliance has evolved in the past few decades, especially, say, since the democratic transition here in South Korea from the late 1980s onward, and how much more affluent and how much more of a player, in a sense, South Korea has become, at least in terms of development issues and environmental issues, all these big problems that transcend the capacity of individual countries to address issues on their own. So say the discussion going forward on the environment, the idea that South Korea and the US can try to work together a little bit more closely to try to address challenges posed by global warming and environmental degradation, or take issues like cyber crime and crypto hacking and the like, which actually is an issue quite relevant to the Korean Peninsula. And a lot of the news analysis on this talked about how it's not so well known that Korea actually has a pretty advanced unit that tries to take on cyber theft, and how coordination with the U.S. might be helpful along those lines. So what we see here is a big picture emerging as something that's much larger than just the usual regional security issues and the question of keeping the peace on the Korean Peninsula. The two countries have really become much more partners in a whole variety of ways, and we could see that time after time in the past few days.
Right, I see. Now, touching on some of the major outcomes, Professor, President Yoon and Biden announced the Washington Declaration, agreeing to launch a new NCG, which is Nuclear Consultative Group. What is the significance of this measure, and how is such new level of extended deterrence going to affect the trilateral cooperation with Japan?
Yeah, this is a very big question, I think, big issue that came out of the summit. And first of all, I think this comes out of greater concern that North Korea now has much more capability than before. In a way, North Korea has been progressing and evolving, but not in the kind of way that the rest of the world would like to see North Korea progress. Now its weapons program has progressed to the point where it's become a greater threat, and that requires a stronger response from South Korea and the U.S. And of course, going into the summit, remember, part of the debate in this country, and in a sense a debate that extended beyond Korean politics too, was whether South Korea should get its own nuclear weapons. And that would have all kinds of ramifications. That would mean that Korea would no longer be in the non-proliferation treaty, that could subject Korea to sanctions or other kinds of ill will or ill feeling or frustration. It could create a lot of tension in the region and beyond. So I think this summit was partly held in the way that it was to try to come up with an alternative path, like an off-ramp for that. And the upshot of that, and then this consultative body that might emerge. So on the one hand, it also means more U.S. strategic assets coming over to this part of the world. I think most dramatically that would mean nuclear-powered subs coming over more frequently, and submarines carrying nuclear weapons that could come in and out of here. And interestingly, when you have nuclear weapons on something that's moving, it becomes less of a target than just nuclear weapons stationary on land. So it's interesting that what came out of the summit was not to return tactical nuclear weapons to the peninsula like we had here 30 years ago, and neither government advocating that, but more in and out vessels coming into this part of the world, often through waters, and more discussion. This is the consultative group, more discussion with the Americans and the South Koreans as to how to use these assets in a way that will have the effect of deterring North Korea. Or if, God forbid, deterrence were to fail, how steps would be coordinated between the two countries in very rapid succession. So not quite as advanced as, say, NATO in Europe, which has a whole host of countries, like 30 countries working multilaterally. This would just be 2 countries consulting, but something that brings the alliance closer than before and is meant to provide more reassurance, not just to the government, but to the public, that this country would not be caught empty-handed if a threat from North Korea further intensified.
Right, I see. I guess the summit came in a very timely manner. Now, a discussion on military aid to Ukraine wasn't really included in the summit, but they did say in the joint statement that they stand with Ukraine as it defends its sovereignty and said that they are opposed to any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the Indo-Pacific region. Does this hint that the two are going to be on the same page regarding these global affairs?
That's certainly what it seems, Bo-kyung, because the most obvious specific reference that would emerge from that kind of general statement would be Taiwan.
Right.
You know, that would be the biggest change, I think, to the status quo in this part of the world. So I think it's reaffirming, the commitment to an independent Taiwan, not a Taiwan that would be taken over down the road in any way, shape, or form by China. Now, if Xi Jinping's China somehow makes a move on Taiwan, what kind of response exactly would that bring about from the 2 countries? I don't think it would necessarily bring about an immediate military response because there's a lot of concern, I think, all around the world to avoid having any kind of hot war break out, even if there was some Chinese aggression in the direction of Taiwan. But that's been left open to question, which is all well and good. So whether, that unacceptability of a potential change to the status quo would result in very tough diplomatic sanctions like we've seen with Russia against Ukraine, the response to that invasion anyway, or whether it would be anything more than that is very much open to interpretation. But that seems to be what they are pointing at anyway in general terms from that statement.
Right. Now, moving on to his U.S. Congress speech, Professor, President Yoon touched on history, especially the Korean War, and thanked the war veterans. This actually comes in line with President Yoon and Joe Biden visiting the Korean War Veterans Memorial on Tuesday. In what way is remembering such history between 2 allies important in bolstering our ties?
I think there was a common theme here that both Presidents Biden and Yoon highlighted at various points during the summit. President Biden brought up at the news conference, I think, that they had at the White House and also at the monument itself. And then President Yoon hearkened back to it at his speech before Congress last night, our time. And it came down to the idea of shared sacrifice in faraway places.
Right.
And both leaders also talked about not just the salience of the American presence here in South Korea in 1950, from 1950 onward, and kind of tying that to universal values as well, the idea that that was to sustain free and democratic, ultimately democratic South Korea, and to keep this part of the peninsula open and free and connected to the outside world in a sense, but also the idea of shared interest as well. So President Yoon, I noticed in Congress, was making the point that Korea joined the U.S. in Afghanistan, in Iraq, that relationship evolved, and that just as the U.S. sent a presence here back in the 1950s, so too has Korea sent troops around the world joining forces with the U.S. Notably, he did not mention Vietnam in the speech, and that I think is a difficult issue for both countries to address. He didn't want to talk about the collaboration in Vietnam, but that is part of the history as well, and one that both countries, of course, have done a lot of work to try to rebuild the relationship with Vietnam over the years. But that was yet another area where the 2 countries have worked together, and the alliance has certainly evolved and progressed, and the 2 countries have been side by side all over the world in many ways.
Right. And another main focus was actually on democracy and freedom. During the speech, President Yoon talked about how he thinks that democracy is at risk and that South Korea and the U.S. should work together to fight against the forces of falsehood and deception. What risk do you believe he was referring to? Yeah,
I'm glad you're bringing up this language in the speech from last night because I found it very interesting. And President Yoon, I think, really caught a lot of interest. He really struck a chord with the members of Congress when he mentioned this because it's been a very big issue in the United States of late. A lot of the angst in the U.S. over elections now and the polarization that goes with them, and the sense in the U.S. anyway, that Democrats and Republicans can almost feel as if they're inhabiting different worlds in political season, that they're getting different versions of the truth. This is a real concern. And as to what President Yoon meant specifically, I suppose we'd have to ask him. It's like we can't totally read his mind on this.
Right.
But I would guess there were 2 things, like anybody reading this speech speech and kind of trying to figure out where he was going with it, it would seem there were two things, and I'll bet members of Congress were thinking of two different things as they were listening. One would be the spreading of falsehoods, the circulation of lies that we often see through social media, and that's a problem in both the US and South Korea and many other countries. You know, content that comes from troll farms, or just nefarious actors that send social media posts out to groups of voters that somehow they've identified as maybe sympathetic to their messages. I mean, I hear stories of my relatives on both sides of the family, sometimes at election season getting these social media posts out of nowhere that actually are kind of slanted and distorted. So that, I mean, that's a problem, of course, that only the citizenry can resolve. That's not something government can really fix. But it's important to acknowledge it. And the other thing that was very timely about this comment from President Yoon was just last week in the United States, there was a major settlement involving Fox News, a big conservative, hardline conservative right-wing network that's known for presenting a kind of distorted version of reality to its viewers. And they just had a big settlement with a voting machine company, Dominion Voting Systems, for $787 million, almost $1 billion settlement, with Fox basically admitting that their hosts on their opinionated shows were spreading false accounts, even outright lies, about how the 2020 presidential election went forward. So that problem as well, that even some large-scale, high-profile news organizations can distort images. That's something I think members of the U.S. Congress and both parties are concerned about. So whether Yoon had that in mind or not, that particular point that he made, I think, was something that anybody listening in the U.S. who's heard about this development over the last week could certainly relate with and understand.
Right, so though we would never know what his true intentions were, there could be two interpretations.
Right,
now,
if I ever meet him, I'll ask him.
Right, right. Next question is that the point is for South Korea and the U.S. to together solidify is order to protect such values, democracy and freedom. How do you believe Yoon and Biden would be able to carry forward their affirmations regarding this aspect?
Right. I mean, both leaders gave a lot of lip service to democracy here, Bok-young, which was all well and good. But my question to them, and as somebody who studies democracy and citizenship, political theory and so forth, would be to ask them how they can take that lip service, those generally affirmative comments about democracy, and try to do something more with it. And I would go back again to the Summit for Democracy that the two countries were partnering and hosting a few weeks back. And what really stood out to me as I was watching all that online, I mean, it's great that it's viewable and accessible for everybody to watch. But when they have those meetings and when they're trying to, affirm democracy in that setting with, leaders of dozens of countries there, everybody who's speaking at that is pretty much in isolation from the people that they represent. The whole thing is online. I know we're still coming back to, in-person political engagement post-pandemic. But if we could see the two leaders, instead of all just saying nice things about democracy and standing up in principle for this, I mean, we know that, leaders can affirm that, and that's all well and good. But what actually has to happen, I think, in both countries is Presidents Yoon and Biden could do a great job as allies to find ways and engage with new kinds of ideas that can make democratic governance more accessible and more innovative for everyday people in ways that they will feel as if they have a say in the decisions being made that affect their lives. I mean, take the diplomacy with Japan right now here in this country. And I think there's a sense that a lot of what's happening, whatever you think about it, whether you're in favor of it, in favor of closer ties with Japan or not, the way the decisions are being made on that are not really that close to the people. They're being made at elite level. So on that issue, or on, say, economic policy issues, or affordable housing issues, or education issues, if there could be more forums and more platforms, both in Korea and the U.S., where the people could be part of the decision-making processes within states and maybe even beyond states, a big issue like global warming, climate change. There is technology now where you can bring citizens together across borders to sort these issues out. I don't know if they've thought this way yet at this particular summit, but that's what, as somebody who studies democracy and knows all the innovative ways that we talk about in universities, that's what I would want to see these leaders pushing forward if they can.
Right. I mean, we could be running out of time, but I really want to ask you this. We cannot leave out his mention on North Korea. While quoting former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, he indicated a red line, but at the same time, he underlined that Seoul will keep the door open for the dialogue on North Korea's denuclearization. How did you see that particular part?
Yeah, I liked this because he was challenging the recent conventional wisdom here, which is that we should now give up on North Korea denuclearization, that they've gone so far along with nuclear weapons at this point that it's almost absolutely unlikely that they're going to give them up. Now, he didn't have a specific plan on how to engage North Korea to achieve that. Honestly, nobody does at this point. If you have a plan, you might win the Nobel Peace Prize because nobody's figured that one out because North Korea is, blowing up buildings at the border that were once built by South Korea to foster that kind of dialogue and cooperation. So it may not be the right moment, but the fact that he's suggesting that should not be given up completely, I think at this point in time, is important and symbolic.
Right. Now, we cannot leave out the state dinner, that took place after the summit, comparing the ROK-US alliance to a four-leaf clover and taking the mic and singing a rendition of American Pie. President Yoon definitely highlighted the upgraded friendship, didn't he?
I think the two leaders really did a great job here because each side has had some mishaps and some awkward moments over the past year. There was the incident back in September in New York just after Presidents Yoon and Biden had met, and President Yoon was caught on an open mic kind of cursing after that. And then recently President Biden's administration was caught spying on the South Korean side, and that was also a kind of awkward moment. So at that event, I don't know if those incidents were on the minds of the leaders at the state dinner. It may not have been on the minds. They may just have been sharing goodwill. But what that said to me and the way that both leaders showed that kind of comfort and harmony, and President Yoon, maybe he knew in advance he was going to be asked to sing the song, but he rose to that occasion and he appealed, as you said, four-leaf clover, appealing to Biden's Irish heritage as well. It showed the president almost in a different kind of light as a charismatic person. I often joke about the Yoon presidency because he came out of the prosecutor's service. He's not been an elected official for a long time. He comes across in Korea sometimes as a stubborn ajoshi, you could say, like a stubborn older uncle. Whereas in the U.S., both at the state dinner and with the U.S. Congress at his speech, where he seemed very natural, he just walked in and shook hands with everybody. It almost seemed like he owned the chamber. And I hope that doesn't sound like I'm exaggerating, but he seemed I was not expecting this, but he seemed to be comfortable there addressing the lawmakers and building a kind of rapport for them. It was a really different side of him. And I think it would be great if he could take that back to Korea. It didn't seem like the same guy who was talking about abolishing the gender equality ministry or the guy advocating for the massively long work week, these kinds of issues that can alienate him from the masses here in Korea. He seemed to comport himself in the U.S. in a way that not only connected with the office holders, but could connect with Americans watching the speech, and then people all around the world, people back home here in Seoul and beyond as well. So we'll have to see if he's evolving a bit on the job and kind of finding his sea legs in the job and becoming more comfortable relating with the citizens and the diplomats, both in different kinds of ways as a human being. And I thought that really came out quite nicely at the state dinner. He had an opportunity there and he really made the most of it. This pitch, he hit a line drive.
Right, I agree. I actually want to see his aspect of that, what we were able to see in the U.S. Congress too when he comes back. Now, wrapping up quite briefly, President Yoon Suk Yeol's state visit is the first one for a South Korean president in 12 years, as we all know. And since it is heading towards the end, how do you believe it will be able to affect President Yoon's approval rating in domestic politics when he comes back?
Right, now President Yoon has the challenge of, in a sense, selling the summit back home. So there will be some constituencies here that will not necessarily be happy. I think in the business sector, we're already seeing some questions about whether the president accomplished enough or gained enough ground with regard to trade, and there's all these difficulties now for Korean businesses about whether recent U.S. legislation that's aiming to bring jobs home is somehow disadvantaging Korean businesses. So figuring out how to win over the business sector and try to find paths forward for the country to continue its relationship relationship, its give and take with the U.S. That will be one thing I think will be on the president's mind. And then also there's a contingent here that wants South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons, that wants the ROK to have its own kind of independence from the U.S. Where now, will he satisfy that element of the public that, would like to see greater independence, but for the time being, it's going to be closer collaboration. Will that closer collaboration satisfy that contingent? So stay tuned. We shall see.
Right. We shall see. Thank you, Professor Schattle, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Bo-Kyun, for having me.
All right. This is our For Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend, and goodbye.